Thank you very much. Well, the Royal Flying Corps. Aircraft, of course, only just started to fly before the First World War, and they were a very primitive stage, but they were assessed before the First World War for their ability as a military machine, and this is some of the comments. The chief of the Imperial Staff recorded a useless and expensive fad. The cavalry thought aircraft might be useful to frighten enemy horses, and the Navy were a bit more positive, so they might need 1 or 2 aircraft during the war, in any future war. And the only officer in the military who saw a real use was actually General Haig. He saw one fly in India in 1911 and thought it had potential as a reconnaissance vehicle. But anyway, despite being a useless and expensive fad, the Army order came through to establish an air battalion of the Royal Engineers. That's the official title of the Royal Flying Corps, established on the 28th of February 1911. It would consist of 3 squadrons. There is no number 1 squadron. Number 1 squadron is a balloon squadron. So the only heavier than air machine squadrons was number 2, number 3, and number 4 squadron. They started off at Netheravon on Salisbury Hill. Very good because, sorry, Salisbury Plain, because Netheravon's on the top of a hill, and it's just like kite flying. It's really good in those early days to have a run down a hill to get the plane up off the ground. Number 2 squadron was later moved to Montrose. Now, most people paid for their own aeroplanes because it was a sort of like a rich man officer's sort of occupation, and they used to pay for their own training and their own plane. This is one. This is probably the best pilot in those early days, Captain Eustace Lorraine. And he had a friend in Northern Ireland. He was 39 and absolutely bored with the army and the Irish. I'm sorry to say if anyone here is Irish, but that was the way he felt. And he wanted to get out. But at 40, you can't be in the Royal Flying Corps. So he only had a few months to go when Eustace said to him, "Come down and join us at Netheravon." He said, you have no idea what you're missing. Come and see men like ants crawling around the ground. His friend was this gentleman, which if you don't recognize it, is Sir Hugh Boom Trenchard, who would command the Royal Flying Corps. It probably wouldn't have been him. It would have probably been Eustace Lorraine who would, because he was the real star in those early days. But it was the typical of the time that even no matter how good a flyer you were, sometimes your plane disintegrated on takeoff, which is what happened. And I'm afraid he died, leaving Trenchard as the most senior officer in the Royal Flying Corps when we come to the war. He could only barely get into the cockpit, incidentally. He was a very large man. Now we come to 1914. Number 2 squadron was in fact in Montrose. Number 3 and number 4 squadron were at Netheravon when the war broke out. The first thing they were told was to pack all their stuff up into lockers and put a little sticker on saying, "Do not open until the end of the war." One person commented that at the end of the war, which was 1918, of course, there was nothing left in the locker. There wasn't even the locker. So one person had a brand new bicycle given to his mum that disappeared sometime during the war. So they never did see all their goods. They were to gather at Swingate Downs in Dover, 60 machines altogether, to fly to France. This is number 2 squadron. And this is commanded by this very large gentleman in the middle, Major Charles James Burke of the ex-Irish Regiment, and more commonly known as Pregnant Percy. Pregnant Percy wanted to have the privilege of being the first pilot to land in France. They were flying to Amiens. They were told what they needed to get ready. They need to take with them a pair of field glasses, plus a spare pair, so because they're going to be looking for things, a water bottle containing boiled water, a miniature stove in case they crashed and wanted something to eat, and therefore they had a haversack containing biscuits, cold meat, a bar of chocolate, and of course a packet of soap concentrated. They were also allowed 1 revolver, and with the orders that if they spotted an airship, they were not to hesitate, but attack with their revolver. The great problem is that getting across the channel, their engines were not reliable. So they would first had to climb 3,000 feet, which is about the height the plane could reach. And then simply, if their engines failed, they could glide their way across the channel. They were heading for Amiens, which was a 1 hour and 55-minute flight. And Percy Pregnant was coming into land quite happily as the first man to arrive. He wasn't. On the left, on the back row, is Hubert Harvey Kelly, known to the mechanics as Mad Hawk Kelly. And just at the last minute, he shortcutted across a small wood and landed just in front of his commanding officer, and therefore had the privilege of being the first pilot to land. There was already a casualty. One plane had crashed with the pilot and the observer being killed. And out of the 60 machines that left Swingate that morning, only 49 arrived at Amiens, ready to take part. By the way, Burke here would later command number 2 wing of the Royal Flying Corps, which is number 5 and number 6 squadron. Later he would go to Canada as a recruiter, but then many officers in the early Royal Flying Corps returned to their regiments by 1916, 1917, because there was a shortage of officers, which he did. And he died at the Battle of Arras in April 1917, leading the East Lancashire Regiment. Kelly also died in April 1917 at the Battle of Arras, but flying a plane. The coincidence is remarkable, and particularly because it's April 1917, which we'll come to, which is a major important month in the Royal Flying Corps' history. Okay. Oh, the 2nd Squadron. Well, wasn't that the 2nd Squadron? Yes, but that's also the 2nd Squadron at Swingate. What we tend to forget with the Royal Flying Corps is any squadron consists of pilots, observers, and mechanics. These were the people who sat down and got those machines working to get up to 3,000 feet to get over to France. There they are, a little photograph, almost the same, taken at the same time. But actually, of course, they're not the 2nd Squadron either. That is the 2nd Squadron, 157 men. Because a squadron just isn't pilots and observers. That represents 24, 12 pilots, 12 observers. The rest is mechanics, fitters, gunners, armorers, drivers, and couriers, and cooks. So it's an entire group. All these didn't get to fly to France. They took the boat from Southampton. Which brings us to this gentleman. Just as the war began, they had created a new squadron, number 5 Squadron. And this is one of the most famous pilots of the Royal Flying Corps, particularly in the early years, is Louis Strange. He wrote a wonderful biography of his life, incidentally. He came from Dorset, I think, of farmer stock. He arrived at Southampton. He was going to fly to Swingate. Number 5 Squadron was leaving a few weeks later than the rest. And he discovered his mechanic, who was supposed to sit in the front on the nacelle of his plane as a counterweight of his Farman, that's a Farman plane, had been pinched as a driver to take a truck over. So he pinched a driver to balance his plane to fly to Swingate. Unfortunately, the driver was 31 stone, and there was a strong headwind. And so they set off from Southampton in his plane to Dover. And there are times when, against the headwind, he was convinced he was actually flying backwards. In the end, he averaged 28 miles an hour. It would have been quicker to drive. But he got there. As he landed, he broke a strut, a longitudinal strut on the plane. Also, he noticed that his passenger fell out of the plane with a large empty whiskey bottle. He was immediately seized by red hats, who then tried to charge him with being drunk on duty. Louis Strange wanted him for the flight the next morning to France, so he managed to sort of say, well, just guard him in a tent, please. He then got in a car and drove to Farnborough to get another strut. That took him until 2 in the morning. He then drove back with it, arriving at 4 in the morning, and then proceeded to spend the rest of the morning putting the strut in himself, because he hadn't got a mechanic. And then it was time to fly off, and it was about midday, and they couldn't find his passenger. He'd gone AWOL. Anyway, they did eventually find him, and he left at 12 o'clock, and they flew over to France. The rest of number 5 squadron had been waiting a day for him, and they were all pleased, and they all came out to see him as he landed, and they all cheered, for which his passenger immediately stood up in his nacelle and took a bow, and then fell out with a very large empty whiskey bottle, and was immediately arrested and had to do 56 days field punishment for being drunk on duty. But that's Louis Strange's arrival in France. Now, the Royal Flying Corps was a mixture of planes. I mean, it really was. There was the Blaireau, there was the Moraine Bullet, there was the Farman. This is what Louis Strange's plane was. This is what number 5 squadron's main plane was, the Farman. Nothing like you would think when we think of aircraft in the World War, really little more than box kites. But there was one standard plane, and it would be the plane that would symbolize the Royal Flying Corps throughout the war. It is the BE-2. The BE-2 would serve almost every year up to the end of 1918, when the Royal Flying Corps becomes the RAF. Every year it would serve in some capacity or not, even as a fighter. The 3 pictures here, that gives you a nice picture at the bottom of a BE-2. There was variations. This one at the top is actually in Farnborough. It is actually being used for an examination for mechanics who are working on that bench there, and that's actually where they were made there. And the one on the right belongs to Rose Morehouse, which I'll come to in a moment, a pilot, but that was his BE-2 on the right there. And that was the plane of the Royal Flying Corps. They had various nicknames for it. The Quirk, that says sums it all, and also they called it Fokker fodder, which you shouldn't say when you're inebriated. Now, the Germans, this is the German aircraft, equivalent of the BE-2 is the Taube, and it looks like a bird, and you can see the German cross on it quite clearly. Now, we come to the campaign. The Mons Campaign, and the first people who proved the value of the Royal Flying Corps in war was Joubert and Dormont. As the British were being, the Germans en masse were heading for Mons, and the British were wondering what was to happen there, Joubert and Dormont prevented the British by their reconnaissance from being surrounded by the Germans and cut off, because they're the people who found the French. Because nobody knew where the French were. They hadn't bothered to tell the British, and they found them, the French Fifth Army, in full retreat. This information meant that the BEF was aware that they had no support and better get moving backwards as possible. So it had served its purpose in preventing the British being surrounded, which they might have been done in an ordinary war. Now, the 80 miles and 3.5 days on the left there is the distance that cavalry reconnaissance, which was the main reconnaissance force of any army up to this date, was cavalry. But this is what the Royal Flying Corps managed to do in the Mons Campaign. They could cover 2,000 miles a day. They covered 87,000 miles in 1,400 flying hours. They were spectacularly much better than cavalry. And they were even responsible for spotting von Kluck's, the First Army's fatal move before Marne, which led to the Germans' defeat. So, their assessment from General French: I will wish to bring your lordships the admirable work done by the Royal Flying Corps. Their skill, energy, and perseverance have been beyond praise. I like the bit at the bottom, which I put in bold: fired on by both foe and friend, and no hesitating to fly in every kinds of weather, they have remained undaunted throughout. Both foe and friend? Yes. The first casualty from the Royal Flying Corps from enemy action, well, any action, was when a British pilot was shot through the leg by a French infantryman when he flew over him. And in fact, this became very irritable, because every time a British aircraft flew over any French position, it was fired on by everything it could possibly throw at it. Louis Strange was brought down and was immediately attacked by French infantry. but the officer rode up on his horse to ask for them to surrender as prisoners of war. Louis Strange didn't want to argue. He couldn't speak very much French, and so he tried to maneuver the plane around the back of the horse in the hope that they wouldn't shoot the officer. Actually, it was better. The officer fell off his horse, and as he did so, the French infantry all dropped their rifles to rush over to put him back on his horse, because they didn't want him to lose his dignity, which gave Louis Strange enough time to get his plane in the air. Eventually, the two pilots, so the pilot and the observer, who had found von Kluck's fatal move, were shot down by French in flames. And though the British complained to the French about this constant attacking British aircraft, and the French replied, and I go back a bit, it's to do with what's on your tail. The Union Jack looks like a German cross when you're flying at 3,000 feet. We can't tell the difference between a British and a German plane. Why don't you, they said, use roundels like the French do? British thought about it and said, okay, we'll use roundels. But National Pride says that we will have red at the center instead of the French, who had blue at the center. But that's why we got roundels. There you are, the brave men of the Mons Campaign, except not one of them's a pilot. See, we always tend to forget they were mechanics. And as the retreat from Mons, the pilots were flying back and forth. These people were driving across the countryside, trying to find a place in order for where the aircrew could land. They had to constantly keep those planes in the air. They're not easy to keep in the air. And they were constantly working, something up to 20 hours a day, sleeping under the wing. And they would have to carry everything that was needed with them, over fields, through woods. And this is a picture showing them working, as you can see, on a BE-2. I bring this picture in because all the woodwork there is improvised. They're all hop bean poles pinched from Belgium hop fields, which were used to help fix the planes between the Mons and the Marne. They were working hard too. So after the Marne, we got to trench warfare, and this is where the plane comes into its being. The problem is that with the trenches going from Switzerland to France, how on earth do you get to see over the other side? You can't send cavalry round because there isn't a round bit. You can't go round the edge. You can only go straight through or over the top, which is where aircraft came in. Now, one thing they could do, operations, you can, because spies can't break through the trenches, but you can take them over the top. And that's what they did. This is Wing Commander Claude Ridley, who won a DSO for a spy mission, dropping a spy behind enemy lines. They also, ironically, carried the pigeons behind enemy lines. They delivered the pigeons by air to the spies on the other side. Not much is known because it were covert actions, so I don't have much on that. One of the first things really was to develop reconnaissance, to see beyond the trenches, to look for build-up for, I'm trying to think of the word now, for an offensive, looking for offensive. Incidentally, this is where cavalry became useless, not so much they couldn't do machine guns, but nothing is easier to spot than cavalry from the air. And every offensive was expecting a breakthrough, which would need cavalry. So if you spot a large movement of cavalry, which was not difficult from the air, you knew there was an offensive to that area. And so cavalry became a liability for the preparation of offensives. So they were able to look, they used to make notes, first of all, and the observer was always the man in command of the plane, the officer, because the pilot is only a driver and usually a sergeant. And for the first few months, that was the way it usually was. It is the officer who is the observer. And they needed to, what they really would like to do is photographs. Now, it wasn't sort of back at the War Office discussing this. This was actually the pilots and reserves on the airfields saying, well, how could we do this better? Lieutenant Charles shows just how amateur it was, actually. He says, I don't think anyone else in the squadron had any photography experience at any time. I had, but I had to buy my own chemicals in the local town, develop the slides in an emergency dark room in the stables of the chateau where we were all billeted, and then send them out. Sholto Douglas, who was appointed air photographer of his squadron, said, "I only got the post because I used to have a box camera when I was a boy." But it's typical of the Royal Flying Corps that the pilots and the people there in the squadrons developed the equipment to do their job, and they developed the photographic section of their squadrons. And the camera is the typical camera that we're using by 1916, which was developed by the observers on the ground. And they could take photographs, and the trench lines came out so beautifully. It really worked very well for the Somme because the entire Somme lines were photographed in detail before the offensive. So they had complete detail from the reconnaissance that took place. Another point was artillery spotting, particularly useful with indirect fire, which is a major problem because you can't spot where the batteries are on the ground, and also for the British and the French, because the Germans had seized all the high ground when they did the race to the sea, and so they were higher up than the British. So it made it harder for artillery spotting from the ground. But a plane can do it. It can fly up and it can see down. And that seemed perfect role. The real problem, though, is how do you communicate with the artillery, whether it's hitting or not? And they had various ideas on that, and they tried them out. As I said, it's a fairly amateurized way of working, but they did. They tried flags, klaxons, dropping notes, firing flares. The French even thought of coal dust, puffing it out in Morse code. But in the end, it had to be telegraphy and wireless telegraphs. I'm going to pause for a second. Oh, my cat was trying to get out there. That's okay. Again, an amateur. The two people involved in developing wireless telegraphy was Donald Lewis and Bron James. Bron was one of the best pilots in the first 2 years of the war, and they developed it. Now, the first wireless telegraphy they produced was actually weighed 75 pounds and took up the whole of the observer's seat. So that meant that you couldn't have an observer on your plane. So these original first areas artillery spotters would have to fly with one hand while they Morse coded with the other. Eventually, they managed to get them smaller so they could actually get them on there. Now, it to just tell the artillery battery things like left, right, short, over, because it just didn't work very well. So again, they thought things through on the ground, and they came up with the idea of having a clock, a map. So you give a number and a letter. The number would be 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, showing which direction, and the letters would be 12 letters, where you would have circles on the map indicating so much distance away from the actual spot that you're trying to hit. And so you would then say your shell landed at 3B. And be it therefore correct. And this became extremely effective. They needed, though, observers who were trained in artillery spotting. And a lot of observers in that 1915 came from the artillery, one of which was Sholto Douglas, who's how he came to join the Royal Flying Corps. He actually flew with Mad Hawk Harvey Kelly, and they were both big men. And they actually had a dogfight with a German plane, a Taube. But it was very frustrating. None of them hit, and eventually they waved and smiled at each other and flew home. But by 1916, there were over 306 aircraft carrying telegraphs and signaling to 542 ground stations equipped with wireless. And so it became a very effective. There was one during the Passchendaele campaign where the Germans failed to turn up with their planes to try and drive the artillery spotters off, and the Germans lost 19 batteries in a couple of hours from the British artillery. Another role they came up with strafing trenches. Now, this is actually came into role when the Royal Flying Corps became the RAF in 1918. And in fact, the summer campaigns is all this because it's the Germans' way of defending is that the trenches are merely triggers. You reach the trench exhausted and then they counterattack. Strafing was a way of hitting the counterattacking troops. But it developed in the years of the Royal Flying Corps, but came into its own in 1918 with the RAF. And the same with bombing. It seems so tempting to drop something on somebody's head, and they drop darts and they drop these little bombs you hold with your hand and you drop it. And this was what was doing in 1914-1915. By 1918, they had big bombs, and they were looking into strategic bombing and bombing of cities. And in fact, there's a wonderful book here, which I mentioned, called The First Blitz, which talks about strategic bombing in 1918. But again, you're going to the RAF. They attacked Zeppelin sheds quite effectively with things like the big bomb. I mentioned Rose Morehouse. He did a bombing mission in 1915. He flew a BE-2 with a 112-pound bomb, and to Portrayed station he was to bomb, and he was told to go low, but he knew he still wouldn't manage to hit it, just dropping a 112-pound bomb. So he dropped to less than 300 feet to do it, which left him open to anti-aircraft gun and machine guns firing from the ground. He was shot up. He was shot in his leg and his stomach. His plane was crippled, and if he wanted to survive, he should have landed and just been captured. Instead, he thought he must report the success of his mission, so he flew back. He landed at No. 2 Squadron's airfield. Sholto Douglas said that he rushed out and helped him out, and he wrote in his memoirs, "We were amazed he even managed to get back." Fitter's memoirs I've got is that the Fitters claim that they actually got him out of the plane. It's which way you look at it. He was shunned medical help. He said he had to report personally to Trenchard of the success of his mission, which he did so. And then as he proceeded to die, they asked him if there was anything. He said, "I'll have a drink." And he died. I mention all this because that's the Royal Flying Corps' first VC, Rose Morehouse, and his BE-2. By the way, bombing began of Paris in 1914, by the way. Just little bombs. Now, with all these specialized aircraft doing these specialized jobs and irritating the infantry and artillery on the ground, you need to deal with them. So, before we do that, there is No. 2 Squadron, and number 1, that little number 1 is where Rose Morehouse landed. That's where he landed. That shows you what an airfield, typical airfield, looked like in 1914-15. They shared it with the Lahore, Lahore Division Camp, which is down at No. 8. So there you are. That's stairs. Right. So the first thing to do is shoot it out of the air with guns. And so we developed anti-aircraft guns, although it's very difficult to actually hit an aircraft with a gun from the ground. So the best thing to do is simply spray the air with shrapnel, usually shells that just burst out in a mass of bullets in all directions, and hope that you get it. It's very difficult to fly through because you've got the stuff exploding around, which doesn't help your concentration at all, but you get used to it. And one pilot who used to fly through the German anti-aircraft guns used to sing this song from George Rawdby, "Archibald, certainly not, move over." And this is why German anti-aircraft corps became known as Archie, from him singing this song, "Archibald, certainly not, Archie." All they actually did was that the pilots, the aircraft would fly higher. So the operating height in 1914-15 is 3,000 feet. By 1917, you're talking 15,000 feet. And by the end of the war, they're getting up to 20,000 feet, trying to keep above anti-aircraft gunfire. Certainly don't want to do what Rose Morehouse and fly in at 300 feet. That is suicidal. And of course, the other way is to try and shoot them out in a combat in the air. The first dogfight ever recorded as a proper dogfight, there was an aircraft, German aircraft, brought down by Mad Hawk Kelly. He did it by attempting to ram it and frighten the poor German pilot to land. And so he forced him to land. He also fired a revolver at him occasionally. But the first recorded dogfight took place with Captain Jackson and his pilot, Captain Fuse. They spotted a Taube and sort of Reed, and Jackson thought, "Let's go and take it." And so he said, "Look, old boy." And Reed was very dismissive. "I know it's there, I know. Can we just go out?" And he said, I think we ought to go for him, old boy. He said, well, shouldn't we better get home and make our report? I think we ought to go for him, old boy. All right, he said. So Reed flew up towards the Tor, where they took 2 shots at it with their revolver, Jackson's revolver. Then the German fired back. Then they flew around, passing each other, firing their revolvers at each other, constantly missing. Eventually, ammunition was exhausted on both sides. Jackson reads over to Reed. Have you got a revolver, old boy? He said, yeah, but it's got no ammo. Okay, he said, give it to me then, old boy, and now fly past him very close, and I'll throw it at him. He missed, and they went home, waving and smiling, honor satisfied. Revolvers and carbines were very effective. What would be effective is a machine gun. And again, it's the representation of this amateurness of the idea of having a machine gun was one pilot's idea, Louis Strange. He had this idea of putting a machine gun on a plane to fire at. And the first was nothing as sophisticated as that, but it was a Lewis machine gun, which he tied to the observer's side and would fire sideways. And in his first action he had in 1915, there was some German aircraft that flew over the airfield at 5,000 feet. It will take a BE-2 15 minutes to reach 5,000 feet. So when they got up there, the several BE-2s sent up to drive them off, the Germans had gone home by that time. But when Strange got, he was the only one who had a machine gun, by the way. When he landed, his commanding officer came up and said, what's that on your plane? He said, that's why you can't climb very fast. You've got a heavy machine gun on it. We're not going to have machine guns on planes. He will continue to develop the idea of machine guns. The 7th of October was the first number 6 squadron. This is the first squadron after, well, obviously after number 5, but it's the first wartime squadron created, and it would have a number of notable names. We have the future Air Marshal Neville on the left. We have Hugh Dowding in the center. Strange would transfer from number 5 to number 6 and become an ace. And the first ace pilot, first person to shoot down 5 German aircraft, is Lanu Hawker, and that's him on the right, who would be also joining number 6 squadron as his first squadron. A number of famous names. Sholto Douglas also comes from number 6 squadron, from that squadron. And here's Louis Strange. Now, he hanged on to his Farman to the end. He was the only one left in number 5 squadron, still flying a Farman. But when he joined number 6 squadron, he got a new mono biplane, a French one. And his first thing he did was he stuck a machine gun on the top wing so he could fire over the propeller. He got into a dogfight, and his drum on the Lewis jammed. So he stood up and tried to knock it clean to get it to replace it. And as he did so, he kicked with his foot the joystick, and this happened. He fell out, hanging only by the drum, which he had just been trying to knock off. The Germans took one look at him and thought, well, there's no point, he's gone, and they flew off. And then he was left hanging upside down, flying with his plane. Strange didn't think he had no hope. Basically, if you have no hope, you might as well try something. So he with one hand, he managed to grab that strut just above him, and then with the other hand, and then he grabbed the wires and he swung his legs up, and he kept swinging them up until one foot would hit the joystick and flip the plane up back the right way, and he fell neatly back into his cockpit. It actually broke his seat, so he had to stand wedged in the plane to fly it back. When he got back, he discovered that the Germans had already announced his death. They dropped a note saying he'd already been killed in action. They were glad to see him. But he is still the only man to ever fall out of a plane and climb back in again. There you are, the BE-2. It seems a bit out of here. They were still flying these in 1917 as a fighter with his overhead machine gun here. But the thing in 1917 is Gould, one pilot called Gould, says that these quirks were death traps. And he thought very proudly he'd nursed this quirk all the way from Farnborough to his airfield in France. And when he got there, they were very upset because he was meant to have crashed it because no one wanted them to arrive. Now we come to the front. the French were really the first to develop a proper fighter. The thing is, you want a machine gun that fires forward because you can aim with the plane rather than machine gun, except the propeller is in the way. So the French came up with the idea of putting metal tips on the end of the plane so that the bullets would ricochet off the propeller. Garand was a great French ace, and then the French hated him because he landed behind German lines and gave away the secret. Not the Germans were interested because they had their own, the synchronized machine gun. And this is the first real proper fighter, the Eindecker, in the winter of 1915-1916, firing it. This is a Dutch engineer, Fokker, developed the idea of synchronizing with the propeller when the machine gun could fire its bullets, so it would never shoot off the propeller. Fokker had actually offered it to the British before the war, but the British weren't interested. So it was the Germans who thought it was interested, and they developed the Eindecker. The Fokker Scourge, it was a deadly plane, but there were very few of them, which I'll come to in a moment, why they were not as effective as they could have been. So the British came up with a fighter. Here it is, the Vickers fighter gun bus. The idea, of course, is that you have the propeller at the back and it pushes the plane along, so you don't have to worry about a machine gun firing the propeller off when it fires forwards. This is an interesting plane, I have to tell you. Well, I can describe it. It would be the fighter of the first squadron. This is number 11 squadron, is the world's first fighter squadron, and this would be it. It could travel at 68 miles an hour. Brilliant. It could climb only very slowly, and it had a habit of, as it flew along, dropping bits of its engine off. One pilot recorded that in 30 flights, he had to force land 22 times because of the aircraft. It was often described by the pilots as the most aggressive aircraft that the Germans possessed, because it didn't know who it was trying to kill, the Germans or them. It was incapable of holding stations. So it came to an end as a fighter because it couldn't escort. If you had 3 of them, they could just not keep stationed together or with a station with a reconnaissance squadron. So that's how the gun bus, but it would be the first British fighter. The one key thing was it was very sturdy, and this meant it became the model for the next, which is the FE2s. They weren't made into a fighter squadron to start off. They were given to number 6 squadron in May 1915, and they're heavily armed. The nacelle at the front where the observer sits, they said it was big enough to do Swedish exercises in, so you could practice your Pilates, I suppose, in there. They were very heavily armed, but as a plane, this is Hawker, who would actually shoot down 5 aircraft with it, but he described it as it neither looked, performed, and certainly didn't handle like a fighter in any sense of the word. It was just a gun machine. You can just see just how many machine guns that the observer had, one up, one across, one the other way. And if they were attacked by Eindeckers, they used to form into like a wagon, form into a circle and simply blaze machine guns out in all directions. The reason the Eindecker was not much use against them was there was hardly any Eindeckers. The Germans had not developed a fighter squadron. There would be 2 Eindeckers per squadron, reconnaissance squadron, and they were just escorts up as far as the German line. They never crossed the German line because the Germans were terrified that if one crashed, the French or the British will learn about synchronized machine guns. So they weren't that effective, but as they could have been. But we now come to the first sort of really looking fighter, the DH2. And Lanor Hawker was already now an ace, was chosen to command number 24 squadron, which actually had planes that looked like fighters, acted like fighters, a single seat fighter with a machine gun. It was fast, it could climb, and it could outclimb and outspeed the Eindecker. The Eindecker was, in fact, outmaneuvered by this thing. It was very maneuverable, which means it's very difficult to fly. And in the early days, it used to spin out of control and crash, and we got the nickname spinning incinerator. But Hawker reassured his fellow pilots by taking the plane up and spinning it in all directions to show that if you fly it properly, it doesn't have to spin out of control. So here it is. They had a machine gun at the front, which was supposed to be maneuvered, but Hawker realized that you just want to aim with the plane, not with the machine gun. So he clipped it in, and everyone else did the same. They clipped it in, but it leaves a big hole at the front, which blasted cold air on the. It was a very cold plane to fly. But Hawker had another idea, and all his pilots followed that. He had 5 gloves on, suddenly, and it would produce 14 aces, number 24 squadron, and the DH2 plus the fees would achieve something that was never achieved at any other point of the war: total supremacy of the sky over the Somme in the months up to and the months after the Somme. These drove the German Air Force, the German aircraft, not the Air Force, German aircraft from the skies. The Germans knew they couldn't, the Eindecker was outclassed, and the Germans could not deal with these. It was such a scandal. There were questions in the German parliament about it. There were articles in the newspaper, where are our German pilots? So the Germans took the idea of forming a proper air force and putting this gentleman in charge. They've even brought a new cross on it. Now, he was an ex-Prussian cavalry officer, but he was a brilliant administrator, and he knew exactly what to do. He just kept the fighter squadrons like the British had, the Jasterstaffen, Hunter Group. The first, there's no number 1, and nobody knows why. It wasn't a balloon squadron, but there was no number 1. Jaster 2 was formed on the 10th of August, 1916, and he picked the remaining Eindecker ace, Bulk, and the Jaster would be known as Jaster Bulk. He's the kind of person you love to hate, incidentally. He was handsome, he was good at sport, good at school, good with the girls, good at flying, good at everything. But he had one thing which the Royal Flying Corps never learned for a very long time. He turned the German fighter squadrons into professional squadrons. No, he would first talent scout. He would look for pilots to fly his planes. Aggressive pilots. One pilot, German pilot, said that he was roared before in a reconnaissance squadron before his commanding officer and told that he was a reconnaissance pilot, that he was to stop chasing British planes, and he was therefore to be dismissed from the squadron. He got in his truck thinking that was the end of his flying career, only to turn up at the Jaster. He was picked as it would be better as a fighter. His fighters were known as Cubs, and they were not allowed to take part in any action until he was absolutely sure they were crack shots, trained, and knew all the tactics. And he had a list of tactics. Do not fire a machine gun to the enemies within range and squarely within your sights. They had a way, if you came up to 50 feet, the Germans would salute you. They put their hand out, they put it back there, drop their hand, and then fire. You'd be close enough to hit then. Foolish acts of bravery and only bring death. Fire from the sun, something that Hawker tried to tell his crews, his pilots, but they wouldn't listen. Because the British on the island weren't doing anything like that. Albert Bohr was the great ace of 1960. Nobody knew what he did. He would get up in his plane at dawn, fly off somewhere, shoot down a German reconnaissance plane, come back and tend to his garden. But what he did wasn't shared. Arthur Gould, the pilot, wonderful because he's actually an ordinary pilot, he's not an ace. He says that when he turned up at his pup squadron in 1916, he tried to discuss tactics in the mess, and they all told him, you don't do that, that's shop, we don't talk shop. On his first flight out, his squadron suddenly dropped down, dived, fired the machine guns, and then went home. Now, you assume they were just testing their machine guns, see if they were working. But when he got back, one pilot said, what's it like to be in your first dogfight? He said, what dogfight? Well, he said, didn't you see the Germans? No, he said. Oh, that's quite common. It takes a few times before you actually spot a German plane. He said, we had one bloke who actually shot one down. He never knew it. Gould also mentions that he was trained on pups, and this was a pup squadron. And he collected a pup, somebody else's pup, and he did a few of the fancy things he knew how to do with pups, Sopwith pups. And when he landed, he got told off by the commander officer because it wasn't his plane. And then his commander officer looked at him and said, how did you do all those things? He was only to discover that 3 weeks before he had arrived, the squadron was given pups with no instructions on what to do with a Sopwith pup and how to fly it. They were just expected to know. We often think, you hear like in Blackadder, 2 weekers. 2 weekers are because it takes you 2 weeks to learn how to survive, not fly, how to survive on the Western Front. And if you manage to survive the first 2 weeks, you probably survive to the end of the war. That is, so many novice pilots were shot down because they just no idea what they were doing. Gould says it took him his 3rd attempt before he finally fired at an enemy aircraft. His first 2 attempts happened to be British aircraft. Fortunately, he missed. He wasn't very good as a shot. But it just takes you so much experience to actually work out where a plane is and whose plane it is. And nobody tells you how. Not Albert Bohr for a start. This would lead to the great tragedy because the one person who could have done what Bulk did was Hawker. He was keen to train his pilots, but he ended up with the #1 cup of Bulk. This person knew from Bulk that if you attack a Phi or a DH2, it's vulnerable from underneath and at the back. And so when they met, they circled and circled, and Hawker had to get lower and lower and lower to prevent this German pilot doing it. They got to 150 feet, and then Hawker tried to make a dash for it, and the German pilot shot him down. The German pilot was Richter Wern. He shot down on his first flight out, by the way, in Bulk Squadron, a Phi, because he knew where to hit it, because he had been drilled where to attack. And then the Germans, with their professionalism, also got new aircraft, 120 miles an hour, 2 machine guns. The Phi can only do 68, DH2 could do about 90, 120 miles an hour. So the inevitable happened. Bloody April, the Battle of Arras. We weren't prepared to do what the Germans did and give up the skies. Trenchard insisted that his pilots went out. As a result, 20% of the Royal Flying Corps was lost in that month. One was shot down every 17 hours. The British lost 245 aircraft, 211 crew killed or missing, and 108 as prisoners of war. A third of those British losses was due just to the Yasta 2, just the Yasta 2. Louis Strange had a word for Trenchard: butcher. A huge waste of life. So what was our answer? Well, not training, that's for certain. What we did was got new aircraft. The Sopwith Pup was a beautiful aircraft, 180 miles an hour. Number 46 Squadron had them. And it's very maneuverable, which means it's not easy to fly. If you let go of the joystick, it will just drop out of the sky like a bumblebee. But that's what makes it so maneuverable. And it was a lovely plane to fly. It was then outclassed by the new German Albatrosses, and so it was replaced with a Sopwith Camel. Again, a much better plane, but it's difficult to fly because of its high maneuverability. It was therefore unstable, and a number of pilots were killed when they first tried flying a Sopwith. So Louis Strange came up, again it's amateur, but he came up with the idea of having a second seat put in where an instructor could sit with dual controls. This is a new thing, dual controls, so he could take over the Camel to prevent it being crashed until the novice, well, it wouldn't be a novice pilot, but the pilot gained enough experience on how to handle the plane. And that's how they train them on the Sopwith Camel. But they're difficult to fly. These, oh, by the way, that just flew in is actually the best fighter of the war. That's the Fokker D7, which was named in the Treaty of Versailles that the Germans could never own. It outmaneuvered those two and could climb to 15,000, 16,000 feet. Now, the best planes were the Bristol Fighter and the SC-5A, because anyone could fly them. They can fly themselves. They are rock solid. They're not like the Pup and the Camel. They're heavily machine gunned. And the British just use sheer numbers to take on the German Air Force. German pilots talk about 15 SC-5As coming at them. And the only thing you can do with them blazing 2 machine guns, 30 machine guns at you, is turn around and head home. Sheer weight of numbers was what the British came up. Here are the losses. Seems about the same, doesn't it? The only problem is that the German losses include against the French and the Russians. So actually, it's not. A better statistic is this one. And just look at the British losses in 1917, 1918 compared to the German losses. It's just, we're just putting loads of people up, loads of aircraft up, but we're not training in the way the Germans were in a professional. Number 9 Squadron was twice wiped out during the 30, completely wiped out twice. That is just a waste. Fortunately, we've got Smith Barry, who at the middle of 1917 did start to the Central Flying School at Gosport, which was his idea was to specifically train pilots on how to survive and how to fight in the air. Something that the British didn't. They trained them to fly, but they didn't train them how to fight and how to survive. He did. He worked very hard at it, and he lost a lot of pilots at it, but he felt that it was better than to try it here than when having a German plane screaming at you. How many British pilots did try training, by the way? The figure's shocking, because it was 6,000 for action and 8,000 for training. So training was pretty awful. The main reason was until Smith Barry used modern planes, we used to train them in the old planes, like the BE-2 and the Avro, and they weren't very good, and they used to fall apart and kill pilots. So what was it like to fly? Well, the physical strain was enormous. Vibration, noise, and engine oil. The vibration is 100, 200 hertz. Now, at that kind of 1/10 of that, you will get a sensation, an automatic arousal of fear and anxiety. At 100, 200, you will fly constantly in a state of anxious, and you will not be able to relax. Actually, incidentally, Louis Strange complained about the number of people who asked him when he was on leave, you know, when you're flying, do you stop for lunch? The noise is also terrific. Warming up, an engine will commit a sound of 120 decibels. Well, a pneumatic drill is 110, and you haven't taken off yet. A quarter of all pilots would suffer hearing loss due from the war. The wind was, if the wind was bearable at ground level, it would chap your skin, cut your lips, alter your breathing rhythm, and increase general body metabolism by 30% by the time you reach 5,000 feet. So you'll be anxious by the engine noise. You will also be very, very high on your metabolism. Cold was unbelievable. Wearing 5 pairs of gloves was normal. For example, if it was 60 degrees on the ground, by the time you reach 18,000 feet, it's minus 45. The average temperature in summer was minus 30 for flying height. And that's what you operated. Minus 20 freezes your eyeballs, which is why you have to wear goggles, because your eyeballs will freeze. It is so cold that the pilot, the ace McCudden, said in 1916 that sometimes he felt so cold he couldn't care anymore whether he lived or died or anyone came, whether it was a German or what. He just didn't care anymore. And then it would literally just damage your sinuses because it ripped out the nasal membranes out and gave you very terrible problems with your nose and colds and things. And frostbite was not uncommon with gangrene among pilots. And then you suffer the enormous pain as you descend back to land by the warmth warming your body up from its frozen state. Oxygen was a problem. Lack of oxygen. 15,000 feet by 1917 is not an uncommon height to fight. In the Second World War, you'd be wearing oxygen. But they didn't. They were even up to 19,000 feet. The air is so thin, you get blinding headaches, your concentration starts to break down, you're slow to react, you're in a very dangerous position, and a lack of oxygen. Also, blood pressure. If your blood pressure is 120, your top blood pressure is 120, at 6,000 feet, it would be 200. And the brain would swell inside, and it would feel like your brain is being gripped as it swelled up inside your head under the blood pressure. These caused huge strain on the pilot. It was said that an A1 fit pilot would last a few months before being declared unfit for service due to the physical demands. The mental strain was another matter altogether. Hawker reckoned that a pilot had 9 months before he would have a mental breakdown. And this book here, which I've got, is a novel, but it's an autographic novel called Winged Victor. It's a wonderful book. It's written about 1918, about a pilot in 1918. And one of the lovely things about this book is you don't realize until about halfway through the book that the pilot who's speaking in the first person is having a nervous breakdown. He's slowly going out of his mind. And they found that. One pilot, Left Bertram Brown, said he was 11th Squadron in 1917. He was just busy in the bathroom in the morning, and then he had this suddenly overwhelming impulse to cut his throat because he was that depressed. Physically, he was fine, he said. Mentally, I was just out of it, completely out of it. It is said that 80% of all groundings in the Royal Flying Corps were due to nervous breakdowns. What made an ace, you might ask? Well, not being a good flyer was one of them. Richter Verne was a terrible flyer. He often crashed on landing. You need to, what I think Bishop, the great ace Bishop, summed up what really mattered. And this is what the Germans practiced over and over again. I learned that the most important thing in fighting was shooting. Next, varied tactics, like knowing where to attack a plane from beneath or above. And last of all, flying ability. You also didn't need to have good eyesight, because your eyesight isn't important, it's your peripheral eyesight that is. You have to have good peripheral vision, because you've got to be able to spot fast moving dots which are coming in at a combined speed of 400 miles an hour. You've got to know where that spot is, a German aircraft attacking you or just another British aircraft in the area. You need good peripheral vision, but you don't actually need. Some of the aces were quite short-sighted. There was always a question of no parachute. Gould wrote a book called No Parachute. He became a vice marshal after the war. And he discovered, now most people think they didn't wear parachutes because people were worried they might be cowardly and abandon their plane. It isn't the case. He found that the reason was far worse. There was a working parachute by 1916. Some balloonists wore parachutes and used them, but pilots weren't. Why not? Well, he discovered by examining the records in the War Office. The simple answer is priority. Once it was thing, you have to manufacture it, you have to produce. So the War Office puts it in the in tray, ready to tell the manufacturers to produce parachutes. The thing is, for the War Office, the priority is killing Germans. It's not saving lives. And therefore, for the whole war, it's sat at the bottom of the in tray because it's not good war trying to save your men. It's better to kill the enemy. So better machine guns, yes. Parachutes, no. And that's why there were no parachutes. Just wasn't regarded as useful. I think Gould's summing up of the Royal Flying Corps years is brave, resourceful. You saw how resourceful they developed photography, they developed all machine guns. Strange with his machine gun, but they were wasted. They took such heavy casualties. There's some of them: Billy Bishop, Edward Mannock, James McCudden. I put him there because, in fact, he is a mechanic. And we always tend to forget mechanics. And mechanics are three groups, actually. There is the fitters. And you know, when you see the films, you see them get out the plane and walk off to the mess. What you don't see is the fitters rushing up to the engine. While it's still warm, they'll test it. They'll take the spark plugs off and put the thumb on to check the pressure. They will test the whole engine. If it needs major work, it will be then removed and sent off back to the factory. Then the riggers come in. They're the ones who deal with the structure of the plane. They'll check every shroud, every wire. All the tension ones are ash, by the way. All the compression ones are, I've forgotten now what they are, actually. I know the propellers are walnut or mahogany. Spruce. The tension ones are spruce. If the plane has to have a wing removed, that was a headache and a half. Because to put the wing back, you have to get the angle exactly right. And the riggers used to say it would be quicker to build the plane than put the wing back on, because it was such a fiddly job. There were also the gunners or the machinists, the armorers. There were 19 per squadron, and they would check obviously the machine guns, but they also checked the bullets. Each plane got 50,000 bullets for 3 days' work. And every single bullet had to be checked precisely, because if one bullet hanged back in the machine gun, by 1917, we had synchronized machine gun fire. If one hang back 125th of a second, you shoot your propeller off. And this happened to this gentleman. Not once, but twice, he shot his propeller off. He found it very embarrassing, so he didn't mention it when he wrote Biggles. That was Captain Johns, and Biggles don't shoot his propeller off, but his author did. Twice. It takes a lot of work, and they got it down to 1 in 35,000, I think, that they've managed to succeed with. to sum up what there's Butcher, who was a book I read, and he talks about two pilots arriving. They had a special mission. Obviously, the ground crew don't know what special mission, but the plane had to be ready by 3 in the morning. So they worked all night getting that plane absolutely perfect for the special mission. The two pilots, 2 lieutenants, arrived, took off, did the special mission, came back, no word of them, got out and went off. What the pilot, the one of them will get the DSO and the other one will get the military cross for it. What did the rigger and the fitter get for all that work they did to make that plane absolutely reliable for it? They didn't even get acknowledgement or even a thanks from anyone for that work. That really sums up what for the ground crew's life was a bit like. It tends to overlook, and even in the films, they're just sort of bodies in the background. Well, I suppose they were just like servants, really, so you don't notice them. And there was also a group of people who often weren't noticed as well, which were the women. There were women in the Royal Flying Corps. They were seconded wax, but they could wear the Royal Flying Corps badge, and they would be drivers for the squadron leader, or they could be couriers. They will later become the RAF when the RAF was created in 1918. But there were women, so you may have a female ancestor who was in the Royal Flying Corps. They were there. Which leads into the end, because I would like to mention just some aspect of life in the Royal Flying Corps with Bott and Marmaduke. Bott was a pilot who was going to France, and he flew to Dover, where of course he would fly. It was thick with fog. He saw the spire sticking out, the church sticking out the fog. He flew around until suddenly he saw a huge white sheet in front of him. He suddenly realized it was the White Cliffs of Dover. He pulled his plane up rapidly and just missed the top of the cliff and landed, well, crash landed in the field beyond, where he found Marmaduke, who had done exactly the same and then crashed in the pond. In the field, apparently, was the Brass Hats, some very senior officers from the infantry who were having a meeting for some reason there. And they gathered round the two pilots. And we listened to Marmaduke discuss the issue of his plane crashed into this pond. He said, where is he? In very colourful language, he danced around the unfortunate bus and cursed systematically persons and things so diverse as the thingamy fool, whose machine had misled us into landing, the thingamy pond, the thingamy channel missed, the thingamy Kaiser and the thingamy aunt, his aunt, and his thingamy contemptible self, and the thingamy Royal Flying Corps for the blankety-blank Army Service Corps and the blankety-blankety-blank Gravediggers Corps and the blankety-blank double-blank Cabinet Minister, and who would want to be a blankety-blank Cabinet Minister? And then he noticed the brass hats around him. So he apologized for his colourful language, and they said, no, it's all right, we're Australian. And then immediately out of the fog appeared a policeman who tried to arrest Bott as a German prisoner of war. Bott explained he was a British pilot, so he wanted to know where the German pilot was that he had shot down. Where is the baby killer? They said, no, they hadn't shot any German pilot down. They just crash landed, but they would like to go into town. They got a taxi into town, and when they got to the Grand Hotel in Dover, the taxi driver refused to take any fare. He said, no, for two heroes like you, he said, I wouldn't. You shot down a baby killer. We saw you. I've heard all about it. The town knows all about you two. As they walked into the Grand Hotel, they were greeted by the staff, by the women flocked around them. Champagne. Nothing was too good for two heroes who had saved Dover. As Bott and Marmaduke murmured to each other, it's nothing like being heroes before you even got to France. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Graham. I really enjoyed that talk. If people would like to show their appreciation, what we do, Graham, is ask them to, they can raise their hands at the bottom of the screen. So, well, I'm stopping counting now. There's well over 200 hands being raised as a thank you for the talk. We've already had one question in, which I'll bring up in a moment, but Matt Pearson asked very early on, I don't know if you were able to help him with this. He said, would he be able to track where his grandfather served in France if he has his grandfather's red number? Be able to?
Yeah, it should do. I mean, you could go for the war records. You can get, you know, that the Royal Flying Corps records are up there. I never traced a Royal Flying Corps person. I've only traced my grandfather, who was a PBI, poor bloody infantryman. But you should be able to, and easy to find the names of the squadrons, people in the squadrons.
Okay. I'm just bringing up one or two of the people asking questions. Just bear with me. Would you like to unmute, Richard, and ask your question?
All right.
We can't. Oh, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm lying in bed because I broke my hip and I'm having to rest a bit.
Sorry to hear that.
But I very much enjoyed your lecture. But you mentioned Billy Bishop, and I'm just wondering if you have the modern view that his CV is questionable.
I haven't. I've read his biography, his autobiography. It wouldn't surprise because he operated on his own a lot, like Albert Hooke operated on his own, and kill claims are a bit easier for Royal Flying Corps. For the Germans, it was very difficult because they always had to have very strict rules on claims because you could get medals from claims. So the Germans had strict rules, which is why they decorated their aircraft so the infantry could recognize them.
I do know that Canadians get very upset about the fact that you might question Billy Bishop, but my good friend Mike O'Connor, when he did some research, he found that Billy Bishop did an attack early morning on some German airfield, and when he went to the German records, there was no mention of an attack at that time on that day.
Yeah. Well, the Germans had theirs. I mean, Hermann Göring was also one for exaggerating claims, but he found it harder to get them accepted. But Billy Bishop's autobiography is a very interesting book on flying, like what it was like to do it and be an ace and how to get a kill. You know, you basically when you kill an enemy reconnaissance aircraft and its pilot, usually that the enemy will not know that you actually done it. You will kill the pilot before he even knows it, because you'll come down underneath and come in within 50 feet, so you can't miss, and take him out, and they will never know. So it's an interesting book on ace tactics.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Trevor, do you want to go next?
Good evening, Graham. I asked about the RFC in Canada because doing some family research, I discovered a great uncle who'd emigrated to the States before World War I, got his American draft card, and it said, we didn't draft him because he'd gone to the BEF. Well, clearly he didn't go from New York City to France, and I eventually discovered him having signed up for the RAF in Toronto. He was a machinist. Do you know anything about what happened in Canada in that? I sort of assumed it was a training role that he was in, that he was working for a training squadron.
Yeah, probably. They did use, like in the Second World, use Canada towards the end as a say for training purposes. And the Canadians produced more squadrons than any other empire, dominion. But I couldn't. The problem with machinists, of course, I'm glad you know, because it's very hard to find them. I mean, it's just the forgotten section of the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF is the ground crew, and I was expected much harder to find what they did. And I mean, I have spent 20 years trying to find books by machinists, and I've only found one. I found two. One only talks about flying, so he's useless. And the other one's called Skills and Devotion. And he is the one main source I have for what it was like as a fitter and a rigger. And he goes on great detail. And basically, but otherwise, they're just a forgotten part.
Yeah,
you know,
it was
you say the
certainly
Royal
hard
Flying Corps, you think of planes and pilots.
Yeah, it was certainly hard to track down. Just one other thing very quickly. My boss in Belfast, Victor, he had been RAF aircrew, an observer, a navigator for 5 years in World War II, and he cursed the Royal Navy up and down for shooting at them when they were trying to land.
So, yeah, Well, the Royal Navy had a policy. I know this policy because from my father's, who was in the RAF, and he was told in the RAF that the Navy has a policy: if it's a plane, shoot it down. Doesn't matter which side.
Yeah.
Just shoot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. Graham, please.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Graham. You mentioned Trenchard, and in 1917 he was known as the Butcher. What is Trenchard's legacy, given the casualty figures of British crew compared to German crew?
Well, he had this idea that what the army wanted, he would give, and it didn't matter about his crew. So he's regarded, oh yes, you know, he was the first commander of the Royal Flying Corps, and you know, there's a lot of reverence for him. But I don't think so. I think he was. What happened in bloody April, and I agree with you straight, he was a butcher, and he just sent them out. The Germans, the year before over the Somme, withdrew because they weren't prepared to take those casualties. So they took their reconnaissance squadrons off. He wasn't prepared to do that, to lose 20% of your force. And good pilots, he lost a number of good pilots because they couldn't cope with the highly trained Jastas 2 squadron. As you saw, it took a third of the kills. The German force was much smaller, much smaller, the fighter force, but it was very trained and it concentrated on specific targets. And they were fighting just as hard in November 1918 as they were in 1917, even though they were rationed because they were running out of fuel and parts. But no, I have not. I've changed my mind about Haig, and I think better of him, but I don't. Well, I used to think highly of Trenchard, but I don't think much of him now.
Well, there's a magnificent statue outside of the MOD in London. But just quickly on Dowding, you mentioned Stuffy Dowding. What's his legacy? What did he take from the First World War that he could use for the Second World War?
Well, in the First World War, now he has a legacy. He developed telegraphy. He became a commander of the 4th Squadron, which took over the development of wireless telegraphy, taking off the ideas that the 2 pilots, James and Lewis, had developed. And he became in charge of all the wireless and organizing the machines and the way it was operated. And that is his legacy. He was in charge of telegraphy, wireless telegraphy, and that's what he developed. And that is a better legacy than he had from the Second World War, but that's another political argument.
Okay. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks, Graham. Terry, I don't know if you've got a camera, but if you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, this is me. Hi from Canada. It's interesting that you've just had the question about telegraphy. So here in Canada, we've been told that there was no such thing as ground to air communications until Vimy Ridge. But if I'm understanding you correctly, it happened before Vimy. So that's the first part. And then the second part of my question is, where would I find more information about the communication? Because that absolutely fascinates me.
Right. Well, the first part I can say is, yes, it was before, but because it was developed basically by 2 engineers, it sort of became squadron located. It would then develop out from that. So it's not like an official development. It becomes official, right, when they make it and they say, oh, look, it works. I mean, as I said, the first ones were these great big things that took the observer's cockpit out, and you have to use one hand on each, which wasn't easy. Vimy Ridge is probably where it was used properly, you know, in a proper part of the campaign where it was not quite so. Like with aerial photography, it was first really used for the Somme as a part of the campaign, where before it's done on an ad hoc basis. How to get more on it? Let me think. Now, I'm having to remember which books I got it from. I've got a whole 2 books on the Royal Flying Corps over there. I'm just trying to remember which books. I know there's one called First of the Few, which is quite good. It's a very good book.
Okay.
But if you take my email, I can send you my sources.
Okay. Awesome.
And
Email. Sorry.
Oh.
Can I get your email? And then I'm gonna. Well, actually, wait a minute. Before you give me my email, I'm gonna tell you that I'm with a communication group here in Canada, and we talk about military communication. And when you mentioned how big the radio was, we have a radio that we use, and it's a portable radio, except it takes 3 guys to carry it. So I can totally understand what you're saying about it taking up an entire seat.
G for golf, P for Papa, J for Juliet, Kemp at virginmedia.com. And I'll be happy to send you some of my sources on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and thank you for your information. It was so good. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Steve, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, as a young Canadian, I grew up on Knights of the Air and Cavalry of the Sky and White House's books. So I really loved all of the First World War air history. You didn't mention anything about the Royal Naval Air Service, the RNAS, and what their contribution was. Was it simply just scout squadrons, i.e. the Sopwith triplanes that were so famous, led by Raymond Collishaw?
Right. Well, first of all, by the way, I've got so many people asking from Canada. I'm Canadian myself, so I just want to put that in.
Good.
The Royal Naval Air Squadron, it kept out because I had to limit it to the Royal Flying Corps. So I don't mention the RAF, which is the Royal Naval Air Squadron plus the Royal Flying Corps put together that becomes the RAF in 1918. The Royal Naval Air Squadron is split in a number of ways, but the bit that there's one which is basically a small version of the Royal Flying Corps. It's not so many squadrons, but it operates just like the Royal Flying Corps, does the same things as the Royal Flying Corps does. And then, of course, there are squadrons which are related to, I do a talk on the sailors that take to the air, which is the aircraft carriers and the sea campaigns where aircraft are at sea, mostly in the sea rather than above the sea, because a lot of them just crash into the sea. But I've kept that bit out because that's a talk in itself, the Royal Naval Squadron. But there is a whole section of it, which is just about 6 or 10 squadrons, which operate almost identically to the Royal Flying Corps, but up in Belgium on that northern flank, just as much as they do, just exactly scout squadrons, reconnaissance squadrons, air artillery spotting, same thing really. Which is why bringing them together didn't seem a problem, except of course the carrier aircraft were different, and so eventually the RAF will split into the Royal Naval Air Service in late 1930s, I think, and become the Fleet Air Arm. But yeah, that's why it's not counted. It was just too much to put in as well.
Very interesting. So where I live, there's Oakville, Ontario. And the Oakville Club, which is a rockets club, has an old First World War hangar as one of their parts of their building. And then down the peninsula towards Niagara Falls, there is another hangar that's now used by a farming family. And 2 or 3 different spots along there were gunnery schools. So it's quite interesting that the amount of flight training and aircrew training that happened here during the First World War.
Actually, it's good because you remind me of the fact that actually the Canadians were better, and it's probably because of that training. I mean, shooting ranges was something that the German Air Force had. It's not necessarily something, I mean, Billy Bishop set up his own shooting range to practice on at his airfield. It was his own thing. So it probably represents why the Canadians squadrons did better, because they were better trained, unlike the British squadrons were. The hangar, I should say, is a luxury. I didn't mention, but my source for the ground crew, Butcher, he mentioned Christmas 1914 as eating his meal under the wing with his fellow rigger while looking at the rain. And that's no mess or drinks and songs and playing rugby. It was just Christmas dinner sent to him from England and sat under a wing. He would have loved even a hut.
Well, great speech, or great talk.
Graham, thanks a lot, Steve. Thank you. I'm just going to read one out from Brian Pascas. I don't know if Terry, one of the previous questioners, is still on, but he has said, could you let Terry know about my article connecting the dots and dashes, wireless telegraphy communication in CEF? It's published in the journal Canadian Military History. So there we go with that one. Now there's a couple more questions that have come in, and I haven't been able to bring the questioners up. So I'll just read, oh, just before I do that, Becca Bernstein says, what was the name and the author of the novel about the pilot who had the nervous breakdown?
Winged Victory by V.M. Yeats.
Lovely.
Winged Victory by Yeats. It's an excellent one. It's a strafer. And he flies Sopwith pups. One of the ways he relieves stress, well, I've got to mention it, what he mentions stress, is one of the ways people relieve stress was that because Trenchard would not allow any army officer to tell his pilots off, they would find generals driving along and buzz them. The best bit was to hit the actual window with your wheels as you went over, or you drove them into the pub. But it was wonderful because the general could do nothing, and it was one way of putting your two fingers up to the war effort. And he describes doing that with such glee. But a number of pilots did that.
I've got a question here from Patrick Hamar, who I've tried to bring up on video but failed. So Patrick's question is, the Sopwith Camel is often portrayed as being the British war winner in the air. Do you consider that to be true, or was it more along the lines of the Spitfire, which was seen as a hero in comparison with the more numerous, but perhaps less photogenic Hurricanes?
Yes, I think the SC-5A, the Bristol fighter, which anyone can fly. It's a plane that flies out. Were in vast numbers, in large numbers, were much more problem to the Germans than the Camel. In a single dog fight with an experienced pilot, a Camel, other than the Fokker D7, could outdo any German plane, any Albatross. But that's not what the Germans saw. It was the constant these SE-5s and Bristol fighter. The Bristol fighter is actually a reconnaissance aircraft. It's not really a pilot. It's not even a proper fighter, but very effective when you don't really need skill to fly it, which a Camel does. It needs skill. So yeah, it's more glamorous. Yes, I would agree with him. It's more glamorous. But the SE-5 was the one that the British tend to rely on, and the Germans avoided because it was en masse.
Okay, and another question that's come in from John Salmon. Again, I couldn't bring him up on video. He says, what was number 2 squadron supposed to achieve from Montrose? The fleet was in the south until August 1914. And anyway, the aircraft lacked the range to get any distance out to sea.
I don't know why they were doing in Montrose. They just were. They were sent up to Montrose while number 3 and number 4 remained at Netheravon. They flew down via York, and I think Louis Strange was involved in a race from Montrose to York in 1913, something that he was involved in. But yeah, they're just stuck in Scotland. It's just probably Scotland's Air Squadron. I haven't actually got information on why they were at Montrose. I only discovered that when I bought recently Louis Strange's autobiography, and he reveals the fact that they were in Montrose before they reached Dover at the start of the war to join number 3 and number 4 on the trip across.
Okay, thank you. Just very quickly, Terry has come back on saying she missed the name of that article. I will read it out one more time, Terry, if you've got a pen. The article is Connecting the Dots and Dashes, Wireless Telegraphy Communications in the CEF 1914 to 18, published in the journal Canadian Military History. If you still don't have that, email me. You can get me at the WFA on the website, and I will send you that on an email. Okay, David, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Graham, for that. It's brought back some lovely memories for me, because I did my dissertation for a degree on the psychological effects of flying in World War I. And I think the book that really got me interested as a 13-year-old was, in fact, Winged Victory by V.M. Yates, which I'm very proud I've still got on my bookshelf.
It's good, isn't it?
If anyone wants to read it, it's really worthwhile reading. It really does set the motion going. But it was interesting you picked up on Albert Ball, because I remember when I was sort of doing my research at the Imperial War Museum, there was some interesting stuff about Albert Ball and how he used to cope when he came back at night. And he was very much, I think, as you've intimated, very much as an individual. And I think one of the things that he used to do was play his violin walking around a bonfire. And that was the way in which he dealt with his, if you like, coming to terms with all the things that you so eloquently described tonight. But I think it was also worth what you were saying as well, was about the fact that Germans were far better at training. And I've wondered ever since whether it was because of the officer attitude that was pervading the Royal Flying Corps that actually stopped them from wanting to actually train, because they didn't feel that they would like to be told anything at all. I don't know what your thinking is on that.
Well, there is an old age British thing, isn't it, that amateurs, because it's trade. We are a very aristocratic, autocratic society, and I mean, part of the reason that the ground crew don't get much mention is that they're servants, they're trade, they get their hands dirty. You don't talk about shop, you don't talk, it's not a profession. It's not a, we're very reluctant to even have professional sportsmen for a long while. It had to be the amateur sportsman. So there's probably something in the British mentality that amateur is better than professional, and also the stiff upper lip among the more aristocratic officers, that you don't sort of cry or reveal your emotions, which then bottle them up. But the Germans also suffered from psychological problems. So there's those mentioned, the physical strain put on you, and the fact you never know whether you're going to live or die the moment you stick yourself into a plane. And they did suffer as well. They got exhausted quite quickly, but they had the problem of being obsessed with the Blue Max, which means number of kills.
That's right, yeah.
They painted their planes in order for you to spot, so their kills could be further from the ground. It's all white, it's Goering, it's all red, it's Richtover. So it was able to establish their kills, because you needed a number of kills to get the Blue Max, and that was the tool that the German Air Force used to motivate their pilots, and they would work and work, sometimes doing 4 missions a day.
Right. Thank you very much, Graham.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. There have been a few more questions come in, but we're running out of time now. So again, I'd like you just to thank Graham for a great talk tonight, very animated. I'll drop you a quick email tomorrow, Graham. But thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it, and this will appear on our YouTube channel in due course. Okay, thank you, Graham. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get